Today is Tuesday, 3rd February 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if once you've watched this program or whichever part of this program you want to watch, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Anyway, today we do seem to be, after roughly 2 weeks of growing tension, in a situation of some kind of de-escalation of the crisis in the Middle East. The Iranians definitely are talking about negotiations between themselves and the Americans, and the Americans seem to be suggesting something similar. In the United States, Senator Lindsey Graham again made quite clear his great dissatisfaction with this. He spoke again about the need for an attack on Iran, of the need to achieve regime change there. The fact that he's been talking so vociferously about all of this suggests to me that there is indeed some form of de-escalation underway and that he's not happy with it. Now, as to what exactly is being discussed, obviously we don't know exactly, but the Iranian media has been giving us some suggestions. They say that there's going to be a meeting fairly soon, that the meeting will be between the United States and Iran, that various Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, and Egypt, will be participating as well, that the Europeans pointedly are not invited to attend, and apparently there's actually been a decision by President Pezeshkian specifically to that effect. Commentaries are appearing in the Iranian media which say that after the Europeans' utter failure to stand by the commitments they made when the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was agreed in 2015, to which they were parties and co-guarantors, their utter failure to act on that, and their echoing of every belligerent position since adopted by the United States under both Donald Trump's and Joe Biden's administrations. The Iranians have concluded that there is absolutely no point in involving the Europeans further in the diplomacy relating to Iran's nuclear program, and that Iran will deal exclusively and bilaterally with the United States. So the deal this time will be between the United States and Iran, and the Europeans are not invited. Now, to the best extent that I can understand, the deal that is now being discussed, and we have not yet had this deal, and it may be that we never will, but the deal that has been is under discussion is a deal that I remember was circulating and which was under discussion in the first half of last year, before the start of the 12-day war in June 2025. The deal was that a consortium be set up to conduct nuclear enrichment, that Iran be a party to that consortium, but that other states, presumably the other Arab states that are also being invited to this meeting, participate as well, that there be a proper system of inspections to guide and control the work of the consortium, that there be a proper system of inspections set up, that the Russians specifically participate in it. And I noticed that yesterday the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, had a telephone conversation with Putin. This is shortly after Putin has met Ali Larijani, Khamenei's national security advisor. The Kremlin readout suggests that MBS and Putin mostly spoke about bilateral matters, which the relations, in other words, between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which they both agreed were proceeding successfully and well. But of course, there's no doubt that they would have discussed the situation relating to Iran and the diplomacy that is taking place there. And it seems to me very likely, in fact, almost certainly the case, that this idea of the consortium and of Saudi Arabia's participation in it and Russia's role in supporting it were discussed too. By the way, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has also said that at the end of December, Russia mediated discussions between Iran and Israel, whereby both countries entered into commitments not to attack each other. And that was apparently a successful negotiation, brokered by the Russians at that time. Of course, it flies completely in the face of the discussions between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump of the United States at the end of December, which seemed to open up the possibility of another attack against Iran. And of course, we saw the protests that then followed, the support for the protests given by the Western powers. And then, of course, we saw the enormous armada that the United States has deployed to the region as well. But anyway, Lavrov said that the Russians did broker in December this agreement between Israel and Iran. And it's possibly the case that there are attempts by the Russians to build on that agreement, even as work is also being done, not perhaps so much by the Russians, but by the Iranians and the other regional powers, to get this consortium to conduct nuclear enrichment up and running and together again in a way that presumably would end the crisis. Now, when this proposal was made last year, there were some sticking points. The Iranians wanted the consortium to conduct some of its enrichment activities on Iranian territory. And as far as I know, that was never worked out and agreed. But certainly there did seem to be progress underway towards that agreement, the agreement to set up this consortium. So if this crisis ends with an agreement to set up this consortium, to set up nuclear enrichment facilities, which all of the Persian Gulf states and perhaps Egypt will be involved in, then this was a proposal that was there on the table last year. It needed some work, it needed a great deal of work, but the diplomacy last year appeared to be going well. And then, of course, everything was thrown into chaos and to collapse by the American and Israeli attacks on Iran in June. And we've had months of tension and months of conflict. The Iranians, for quite a long time, were insisting that they would not be willing to conduct negotiations with the Americans until they received a promise that the United States and Israel would not attack Iran again. Perhaps if what Lavrov is saying is true, which I presume it is, by the way, I'm sure it is, in fact, the Israelis did give that promise in December, though, as we see, it might not be worth that much. The Americans so far have not given that promise. Nonetheless, despite the Iranians taking that position, they've stood their ground up to now. and have rejected negotiations, but now appear to have agreed to them. And it might make sense for them to agree to negotiations because the proposal is the same one that was being discussed last year before the attacks on Iran began. Now, I fully expect that if this consortium is set up in the way that is being talked about, there'll be people in Washington, perhaps some people in Europe, who will say that this is a great victory for the West. It is nothing of the kind. If this is how it does end, it means that instead of all of those attacks, all of those attempts at regime change against Iran that overtook the negotiations starting from June last year, instead of those attempts having succeeded, they have actually failed, obliging the United States to return to a proposal which was already on the table before those attacks took place. It would be a defeat for the United States, not a victory. I say that, though, to be very clear, defeat or not, it is absolutely the right thing, as far as I am concerned, for the United States to do. One should not criticize people for doing the right thing, even if it comes after them doing for months very, very bad things. You could say that it's the Americans coming back to their senses, but nonetheless, lots of people have died, lots of damage has been done, tensions have been stoked to an extraordinarily high level, all to bring us back to exactly the same position that we were in before. Now, it would not just be, in a sense, a victory by Iran, for Iran, in terms of its own nuclear enrichment proposals and its own survival as a political system. It would be a decisive victory because it's been obvious since at least 2024 that there's been a sustained attempt by various people in the United States and by the Israeli government to engineer some kind of regime collapse in Iran. And if we now get an agreement to set up this consortium, that will be an acknowledgement that this attempt has failed. And that would also be a further acknowledgement that the government of Iran is here to stay and that Iran itself is here to stay and that it retains its pivotal role in the Middle East, which nothing has been able to change. So there we go. That's where it looks as if we might be going. There are lots of things that can go wrong. As I said in my program yesterday, the American build-up in the Middle East still continues. There's been no orders yet countermanding it or ordering a ramping down or anything of that kind, a scaling down. For the moment, the US military is there, but the negotiations, at least for the moment, seem to be starting. The Iranians, of course, were caught by surprise when there were negotiations before. They are not going to be caught by surprise again. So, as well as all the tension and violence and death and destruction we witnessed over the last year, there's also now a large measure of mistrust, which I suspect it will take years, probably decades, for it to fully dissipate. And this, of course, on top of the enormous mistrust that is already there. Anyway, that's where we appear to be at the moment. Perhaps it is unwise to move too far ahead. Apparently, the chief negotiators on the Iranian and American sides will indeed be Arakchi and Witkoff. We'll just have to wait and see whether they are able to reach an agreement and where this agreement is going. I'm going to finish with one further comment. The Europeans are not there. The Iranians don't want them there. The Americans and Israelis don't seem to be insisting that they should be there. The Arabs don't seem to care whether they're there or not. The Russians have a role. The Europeans have none. Here we have further evidence of Europe's total, complete irrelevance. Its complete irrelevance in global affairs. The best writer on this, the best writer consistently on this topic, by the way, is Thomas Farsi, who has been writing a series of brilliant articles on his Substack site and in the British centre-left magazine Unheard, in which he charts Europe's decline into diplomatic irrelevance. Irrelevance is actually a generous word. Diplomatic non-existence would perhaps be a more accurate way to describe it. In 2015, when the JCPOA was negotiated, in the days of Barack Obama, which now seems so long ago, well, at that time, Europe was a player. It was a player in the Middle East. It was a player in Ukraine. It was European governments that mediated, that brokered the Minsk II agreement in 2015. The governments of France and Germany, to be precise, Angela Merkel and François Hollande. It was European governments that played a significant role in agreeing the terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was the Europeans who were parties to the negotiations that led to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and who were parties to the agreement itself. And now they have no role in Ukrainian diplomacy, in the diplomacy over the conflict of Ukraine. President Macron of France, who's putting himself forward all the time now as Europe's chief negotiator, though I'm unaware that anybody else in Europe has nominated him for that role. Anyway, he now says that a discussion between him and Putin is going to be prepared, but there are still apparently technical obstacles that stand in the way. And I discussed in my program yesterday how the comments of his own foreign minister, Monsieur Barrot, call into question the point of such a diplomatic exchange, if it can even be dignified by that name, given the entirely extreme positions that Macron appears to be intending to take. So basically, the Europeans are frozen out of the Ukrainian diplomacy. They are now frozen out of the diplomacy relating to Iran and its nuclear enrichment program. And they are also completely frozen out of the diplomacy relating to the Middle East. Nobody takes them seriously anymore. Nobody is interested in hearing what they have to say. They have nothing interesting to say. A continent whose chief diplomatic representative is Kaja Kallas is not going to be taken seriously at any level by any party, given that the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio also doesn't bother to meet or confer with her. Well, that tells you all you need to know. The bankruptcy of Europe and of its diplomacy could not be more comprehensively and completely exposed. And, well, there is perhaps one further point to make, because the latest crisis, or at least the latest American troop deployments, the enormous threats that have been made against Iran, well, they were all supposed to be in support of the protests that took place in Iran at the beginning of last month. Now, I've discussed those protests in many places, and I'm not going to repeat the many things I've said about them. But anyway, the media were full of them. There was lots of talk about the need to support the protesters. President Trump talked about the protesters as well. All of that. There was also talk that the Iranian government was just about to collapse. And the fascinating thing is that now we're no longer seeing any discussion about the protests, the protesters, the support for the protesters. The whole topic is starting to vanish down a memory hole as President Trump talks again about the nuclear issue, which appears to be the only topic that his negotiators, who are going to be meeting with the Iranians, are going to discuss. So, further confirmation, by the way, that the Iranian government is here to stay. There was, by the way, a long article in the Daily Telegraph, of all places, which admitted the same thing, just to say. So the Iranian government is here to stay. Everybody knows it. Everybody acknowledges it. It's not going to be overthrown by a protest movement. It is too strongly embedded in Iranian society, too strongly supported by a critical mass of Iranians to be overthrown in that way. A military attack on Iran is too risky, too problematic. Negotiations have to be the way forward instead. And the way to negotiate is to negotiate in the way that was proposed last year, returning to the topic of the consortium. Now, if anybody seriously believed that the United States was acting on behalf of the protesters, instead of using the protesters to push forward its own agendas in relation to Iran, I suppose they have been cruelly disappointed. I am not one of those people. If I have to be honest, I don't think many of you who are watching this program are disappointed or surprised either. But perhaps it's worth just making that point. Anyway, this is the situation today. As I said, in relation to the Iranian crisis, if it works out as it seems it might do, this is a setback or even a defeat for the United States. But of course, there's still a lot of uncertainty. The forces are still there. We'll see how things play out over the next few weeks. Now, in the meantime, the situation in Ukraine continues to go through an enormous process of escalation. Yesterday in my program, I said that the Russians had pointedly made clear that they were not extending the 7-day ceasefire that President Trump foisted on them in the electricity or energy war last week. As far as they were concerned, it ended on Sunday. President Zelensky made a desperate attempt to get it extended until the 8th of February, in other words, for a further week, but the Russians clearly were not interested. I said that it seemed to me that a big strike was coming, and we got that big strike last night. Only it was not a big strike. It was an enormous strike. I believe that if not in the number of missiles and drones launched, certainly in the power of the missiles used, it can be justifiably called the biggest strike that the Russians have conducted in the war so far. Now, I say that there is a great deal of confusion as to the exact number of missiles that the Russians did use last night. And I've seen various numbers floating around, particularly in connection with the numbers of Iskander M missiles that were launched against Ukrainian targets. One figure that I've seen suggested is that the Russians launched 60 Iskander missiles last night, which I think would be a record and which would be an absolutely devastating blow. Another source has put the number at less than that, around half of that, at 32. I, of course, don't know. And there is some confusion as well, because there is some reports that some of the ballistic missiles that the Russians launched last night were not Iskander M's at all, but old surface-to-air missiles, S-300s and that kind of thing, which the Russians were using as decoys. Well, again, I'm not certain of that, and I'm not going to speculate about it. But regardless, certainly it does seem as if dozens and probably scores of Iskander missiles were launched at targets across Ukraine last night. And other missiles appear to have been launched as well. Interestingly, not Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, but there are reports that 2 Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles were again launched from Crimea. The Russians also seem to have launched, in support of this strike, Kh-101 subsonic cruise missiles launched by their strategic bombers, their Tupolev 95 bombers. And they also seem to have launched a certain number of subsonic calibre missiles launched from the Black Sea by the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And, well, beyond that, there are also reports that these huge, monstrously huge, enormous, and extremely powerful Kh-32 missiles, anti-ship missiles, originally designed by the Soviet Union to attack US Navy carriers, that they were launched against targets as well, and that they were launched from their usual carriers, which are the Tupolev 22M3 bombers. So an enormous strike with hundreds of drones, allegedly around 350 Geran drones. That's according to the Ukrainians. I, of course, am not there to count them. The Russian Defense Ministry has said very little about the extent of this strike or its purpose. They have said a few things. They've said that there was this enormous strike yesterday. Their report says that last night, in response to terrorist acts launched by Ukraine against civilian facilities in Russia, the Russian armed forces carried out a massive strike with long-range ground and air-based high-precision weapons, strike drones against enterprises of the Ukrainian defense industry, energy infrastructure that supports their work, as well as long-range unmanned aerial vehicle assembly and storage areas, which is what the Russian Defense Ministry mostly says about these attacks now. It hardly adds anything to what we know. There are reports trickling out of Ukraine about the effect of this strike. It seems as if the cities of Kharkiv and Dnipro were particularly badly affected. The mayor of Kharkiv is talking about a very, very bad situation in his city. There are reports that large numbers, one report puts it up to 18 Iskander missiles attacked one power station, one big thermal power station on the outskirts of the city of Dnipro. That seems excessive, actually. But anyway, allegedly this power station is out of action. There was a very powerful attack against energy facilities in and around Kiev as well. And importantly, there are reports that an electricity substation was also attacked. And this particular electricity substation is the substation that channels power from a nuclear power plant in western Ukraine to Kiev itself, so that if this substation is out of action or has been destroyed or cannot be repaired, then Kiev, for the time being at least, is unable to receive power from this nuclear power station. Again, I want to stress, I don't have the exact details as to what was attacked and where, but the Russian Defense Ministry says in its report that it was indeed energy facilities which were amongst the targets which were attacked. Now, as I've discussed in recent programs, the energy situation in Ukraine is terrible. We've had hours of blackouts across Ukraine, days of blackouts. Whole cities have been plunged into darkness, and there's been problems with heating and even the supply of fresh water. And now, on top of this already dreadful situation, we've had another attack of this kind, with no reason to think that more attacks like this might not be coming. So, a gigantic attack on the energy system last night. The Ukrainians were probably expecting something big. I wonder whether they expected something quite as big as it came. If up to 60 Iskanders missiles were used in a single strike last night, then, well, this is not only enormous, but game-changing. It would suggest that production of these missiles in Russia is running forward now very, very fast and with devastating effects. But again, I want to stress, I'm not able myself to count the missiles. We will probably get more information about the extent of the damage and of the crisis that it is causing over the next couple of days. I would add that temperatures across Ukraine appear to be plunging. Ukraine is going through a particularly cold stretch at the moment. Well, we will see what the additional effect of the strike has been and of the effect that it has on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. So that enormous strike has happened. The Russians continue, by the way, their advances on the front lines. I said in my program yesterday that their advances are accelerating, that the entire front line appears to be in motion, with the Russians moving further westwards. Some reports say that the Russian advance is now averages between 15 and 20 kilometers a day, which may not seem like enormously fast, but I think for this kind of war would be very fast. And in Zaporozhye region, when it comes to the forward advance of the Russian forces pushing towards Orekhov and Zaporozhye city from the west, well, the advance there appears also to be quickening. And I'm going to make a guess that over the next couple of weeks, it is going to quicken much further, and we're going to see a much bigger, faster advance altogether. But I'm not going to discuss the situation on the ground in detail in this program. What I propose to do instead is to return to the topic of whether or not the Russians have hardened their negotiating position following the drone attack on Putin's residence in Novgorod near Lake Valdai. Now, I pointed out in earlier programs that according to Putin's aide, foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, Putin told Trump when they last spoke on the phone on the 29th of December of last year that the Russians, following this strike, would indeed harden their negotiating position. And this was clearly set out by Ushakov. Then, a few days later, in early January, Putin met in the Kremlin with foreign ambassadors who were presenting him with their credentials. And he spoke about how a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine would be connected, must now hinge on the agreement of a new security architecture for Europe. And I suggested that this might be how the Russians, following on from what Ushakov says, Putin told Trump, how the Russians might be now hardening, strengthening their positions, and that they might now be linking the settlement of the conflict itself in Ukraine with a settlement, an agreement about Europe's new security architecture. And I said that America's agreement to renegotiate the entire security architecture of Europe seemed to me so unlikely that the Russians making that kind of demand made a diplomatic resolution of the conflict all but impossible. And then I got pushback, and the pushback came from very serious people for whom I have an enormous respect and whom I take extremely seriously. People like Gordon Hahn and Ray McGovern. And separately, each of them said that it looked as if I might be over-interpreting or over-analysing what Ushakov and Putin himself was saying. And I still acknowledge, by the way, that over-analysis, over-interpretation is a risk, and I thought that there was at least an argument that I might have been engaged in it, though I still thought overall that Ushakov's words especially were clear enough. Well, yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry provided some clarification on this point, and it's not entirely full or satisfactory, as we will see, but it has actually squarely addressed this issue. And this arose from a vast summary of the international situation that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave to journalists about 2 days ago. And in it he described a couple of days ago actually, this was on the 20th of January, to be precise. He described the overall state of the world, the overall state of diplomacy in the world, by definition, because so many topics were covered, he wasn't able to go into a huge amount of detail about any of them. But anyway, he laid it all out there. And he did take some questions about the situation in Ukraine, but in my opinion, he didn't say anything that was particularly original. But someone in the Foreign Ministry, over the course of the last 24 hours, appears to have taken the view that it was necessary to supplement Lavrov's press conference of the 20th of January with some additional questions and answers. The questions clearly drafted by someone in the Foreign Ministry itself, creating the impression that this was a follow-up to the press conference, but clarifying Russian positions, most specifically on the issue of Ukrainian settlement. And so the first clarification addresses that very point that I'd made about whether, following Valdai, the Russians were hardening their negotiating position. And let's now go and see what the Foreign Ministry says. So the question was this: you have claimed that Russia will review its negotiating position following Kiev's shift towards a policy of state terrorism. What exactly in Russia's old position is now viewed as being unacceptable or irrelevant? What is the new position, and how will Russia deal with the opposing side if they are essentially recognized as terrorists? How do you plan to continue the talks? So that's the question. And notice that it already contains information, because it says that the Russian authorities now classify Vladimir Zelensky and his senior officials as terrorists. And then the Foreign Ministry, and we're told it is the Foreign Ministry, not Lavrov himself, but the Foreign Ministry, replies as follows. As you know, in the early hours of December 29th, 2025, the Kiev regime attacked the Russian president's state residence in the Novgorod region using dozens of long-range drones. Fortunately, they were all intercepted. The public has seen the footage of our military handing over the mission controller from one of Ukraine's drones to the United States. Many countries could once again see the terrorist nature of Vladimir Zelensky's clique. I hope his sponsors also drew their respective conclusions. So, firstly, the Foreign Ministry is clearly here linking any hardening of the Russian negotiating position to the attack on Valdai, which is exactly the point that I've made in my programs, and which is exactly the point that we have made on the Duran. The Russians are themselves saying that Valdai is the key point of departure. That's what these words are saying. They're qualifying the attack as a terroristic attack, and they are talking now about the terrorist nature of Vladimir Zelensky's clique, as they call it. Not even a regime anymore. It's been delegated to something even less than a regime, basically a terroristic clique. And then there is a long paragraph about terrorism. We openly state and highlight that terrorism in any form is unacceptable and certainly does not help achieve a political and diplomatic solution to the conflict. Kiev is only complicating its own life with its recklessness and impeding efforts to find possible compromises. Caught in a Zugzwang. Zugzwang is a concept taken from chess. It's a German word, but basically it is one which says that a Zugzwang is a situation where a player finds that whatever move he's forced to make, he finds himself in a position where he's forced to make moves which will make his overall position even worse. He's in a losing situation, in other words. Caught in a Zugzwang, Zelensky's regime continues its attempts to dictate its conditions by imposing its own resolution model that, according to the regime's concept, must rest on some sort of security guarantees for Ukraine. These guarantees include the deployment of so-called multinational forces on Ukrainian territory, that the so-called coalition of the willing must form to help the Ukrainian armed forces with recovery and to deter Russia once the hostilities have ended. In other words, they will create a foothold to continue their fight against Russia. The deployment of military units, facilities, warehouses, and other infrastructure of the Western countries in Ukraine is unacceptable to us and will be considered as foreign intervention that directly threatens Russia's security. Clearly, we take into account all these actions by Kiev and its curators when defining our negotiating position. So this is a very curious answer, because they say that Zelensky and his clique are terrorists. They say that the entire topic of security guarantees and deployments of European forces in Ukraine has originated from Zelensky and the Ukrainians and is clearly intended to perpetuate this terrorist regime and is unacceptable to Russia and is seen by Russia as a direct threat to Russia's security, which Russia is obliged to respond to. And they go on to say that all of these moves taken together must result in a hardening of Russia's negotiating position. We take into account all these actions by Kiev and its curators when defining our negotiating position, but they decline to tell us how exactly that negotiating position has been hardened. And, well, there's a number of things I would take from this. Firstly, I think that the Russians have indeed hardened their negotiating position. I don't again see how it is possible to interpret these words in any other way. Both the question, which, as I said, I am sure has been drafted by the Foreign Ministry, and the answer itself. It is frustrating that the Russians are not telling us in what way they've hardened their negotiating position. It's likely that they have explained this to the Americans, but as the Russians always do, they say that they will not share what they say in private during negotiations with the public, so they won't tell us. But it does seem to me as if some hardening of the Russian position is indeed taking place. Now, previously, I speculated that the Russians are linking this with their demands, which are becoming increasingly strong, by the way, for a renegotiation of the security architecture in Europe. Having read this reply from the Foreign Ministry, I no longer think so. Nowhere in this reply is the question of the security architecture in Europe brought up in relation to the hardening of Russia's diplomatic stance or the incident, the attack on Valdai. What the Russians are talking about instead is the terroristic nature, as they claim, of Zelensky's regime and of the way in which the security guarantees that have been talked about in the West for Ukraine appear to be intended to perpetuate it. And the Russians are making it clear that these security guarantees are unacceptable. Lavrov said it in his interview to the Turkish media on the 29th of January, and the Foreign Ministry is saying it here as well. The security guarantees that the West is talking about, concerning which the Russians have not been informed or even consulted, are unacceptable. The deployment of European forces in Ukraine is unacceptable. It is a threat to Russia's security and will be treated as such. But perhaps the more interesting thing here is the point about prolonging the regime and its terrorist nature. So I wonder whether what has happened and what is happening in private discussions between the Americans and the Russians, and what perhaps Putin communicated to Trump over the course of their conversation on the 29th of December, is that the Russians no longer accept the current regime in Kiev as any kind of long-term interlocutor. They expect to see it ousted from power, regime changed out of existence as part of a diplomatic settlement because of its terrorist nature and because of the threat it poses to Russia. So the hardening of the Russian position is in effect regime change. That the Russians maybe at some point last year accepted that Zelensky was de facto the leader of Russia. Putin has often talked about Zelensky's position being unconstitutional and Zelensky having no right to sign any agreements on behalf of Ukraine because of his unconstitutional status. I'm going to make a guess that at some point around the time of the Anchorage meeting, the Russians dropped this proposal and said that, rather dropped this demand, said, well, look, we don't like Zelensky. We don't think his position is constitutional. But you insist on saying that he is the president of Ukraine, and we will go along with that because, well, there isn't anyone else at the moment. I wonder whether the Russians aren't telling the Americans, look, we treated Zelensky, you wanted us to treat Zelensky as a negotiating partner. We agreed to do so, though without much in the way of conviction. After what happened in Valdai, you cannot expect us to go on doing so. Whatever final agreement is reached, Zelensky cannot be part of it. He cannot even sign it because he would be signing it as someone who is not the constitutional president of Ukraine. And from this moment on, basically, what we need to discuss is the eventual transition of power in Kiev from Zelensky to someone else, uncontaminated by all of this and acceptable to us. Perhaps, again, I am overinterpreting, but this is perhaps how this particular statement from the Foreign Ministry reads to me. This is how it reads to me. Now, it might also explain something else, which is why Zelensky himself is so keen to get a meeting with Putin, why he has been talking relentlessly about the importance of another bilateral meeting between Putin and himself. The Russians have not rejected such a meeting outright, but they've placed a condition on the meeting which is so impossible that it teeters on absurdity. And it looks to me, and I have to say this as the Russians sticking two fingers up at Zelensky, saying, well, yeah, we're fine to meet, but the meeting must be in Moscow. Not only must it be in Moscow, but it cannot take place anywhere else. Zelensky must come to Moscow, he must meet Putin, and if he wants to meet Putin, Putin will see him. But there is no way, no possible circumstance in which Putin is going to go anywhere to meet with Vladimir Zelensky. So Zelensky, of course, has rejected that proposal, as he was bound to do. And, well, I wouldn't say that this is a polite way of the Russians rejecting a bilateral agreement with Zelensky. As I said, to me, it looks more like them sticking up two fingers at him. That might be my own interpretation. But then see again what they say about him and about his government in this statement that they've just published. They talk about the terrorist nature of Vladimir Zelensky's clique. Not the government of Ukraine. It's not even the regime. It's Zelensky's clique, which is a bunch of terrorists. So anyway, there we go. We will see what goes on. Now, the statement doesn't just finish, by the way, in discussing the hardening of the Russian diplomatic position. They talk about other things too. There's an interesting section on the Oreshnik strike, which directly follows. They don't add any information to what we already know. The question, which again, as I said, I suspect is written by the Foreign Ministry. Russia used Oreshnik, its state-of-the-art missile system, once again in the early hours of January 9th. This time it took aim at military targets in the Lvov region and carried out this strike very close to EU territory. Notice the care to remind everybody that the strike took place close to EU territory. Many foreign politicians saw this move as a signal not only and not as much to Kiev, but to Brussels. Did Russia want to send this message? And if so, has Oreshnik fulfilled this mission? Now, the interesting thing about this, the Foreign Ministry's purported answer, as I say, bear in mind they're probably writing the questions too, is that they don't actually answer the second part of the question. Was this a message directed at the Europeans, the Oreshnik strike? Instead, they say that the Russian Defense Ministry has already explained that it targeted the Lvov, a state aviation and repair plant, that it did all the damage there to the F-16s and MiG-29s, and how Sergei Narishkin, the head of Russian intelligence, has shared his assessment regarding the outcomes of the strike in his public comments on January 26th. So they don't actually say, was this actually as intended as a signal to the Europeans? So they don't say that it was, and they don't say that it wasn't. They just ignore this part of the question that they probably wrote out themselves. Now, I'm going to suggest again that this is as much a signal as anything else. They don't want to be seen directly threatening the Europeans with the Oreshnik, but they are in effect threatening the Europeans with the Oreshnik. They don't say that we launched the Oreshnik against this facility in Lvov because it is close to the EU border and therefore is intended as a message to the Europeans. But they don't deny any of that in response to what is probably their own question. So I read that to mean that it was a message intended as a message to the Europeans. If it had not been, surely the Russians would have denied it. They would have said, no, that interpretation was wrong. It had a purely military purpose. Incidentally, on the subject of the Iranian strike on the facility in Lvov, I should say that I received a very, very interesting email over the last 24 hours from the same person who told me in early 2024 that the Russians were setting a trap for the Ukrainians in Kursk region, luring them into launching an offensive there, which they would spring the trap closed on in order basically to drain Ukraine's reserves. And I remember when the attack on Kursk came, and following the various counter steps that the Russians took, this person wrote to remind me how he had himself said, warned me previously that an attack on Kursk region was coming. Well, this person has written to me again, and he's reminded me of an earlier message that he sent to me way back, in fact, in 2023, informing me about this facility in Lvov, this very same facility that the Russians attacked in January, on the 9th of January, reminding me that in his email, this was an email written in 2023, reminding me how in that email he pointed out that the Europeans in particular were using this facility as basically a coordinating center and a command center, that the Russians were very well aware of this and were becoming increasingly frustrated about it. And as that email from 2023 said, I'm not going to quote the exact words because this is a private email, but the email said that the Russians had some interesting new weapons in mind that they might use against the facility. And that was written in 2023. Obviously, I have the emails, I have the date stamps. There is absolutely no doubt about this at all. So, a plan, strike against this facility that it seems was in long preparation. When you get information of this kind from a source, by the way, obviously and by definition, that must confirm the reliability of the source. Just saying. Anyway, returning to the statement, clearly, it's clear from the way the statement is couched that over and above and beyond the damage to the facility involved, which does seem to have had some kind of Western connection, the Russians were indeed conducting a strike near to the EU border in order to send a signal to the people in Brussels. And the fact that there's been more discussion in Europe about conducting negotiations, or at least opening up some kind of diplomatic dialogue with the Russians since the Oreshnik strike, and Macron's latest words, well, all of that must suggest that the Oreshnik strike did indeed have the effect it was intended to. So anyway, a very interesting statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry. Now, Putin himself, I should say, has been very quiet over the last few weeks. We had a flurry of activity from him as soon as he came back from leave in January, in the second week of January. He has, it must be said, conducted meetings with all sorts of important Russian officials. He's met with the generals. He's met with other important officials as well. But overall, on Ukrainian matters, he has been relatively quiet over the last few weeks. I suspect that he's working, and his team are working on preparing for the next big meeting with the generals, or perhaps it'll be some kind of further Q&A, press conference, or who knows what. But I suspect that there's going to be a big statement coming from Putin before very long. In the meantime, to repeat, the war continues. The Russians are escalating relentlessly the war in the sky, and they continue to advance remorselessly on the front lines. And there was apparently an article in Military Watch magazine, which I missed, which spoke about Ukraine's armored forces being in a very rundown condition with only 20% of the tanks operational. And there's been more reports about manpower shortages in the Ukrainian army, about the gaps that are being created, the growing gaps that are being created on the front lines, and about how the Russians are taking advantage of these. There's also, of course, in the media in the West, continued claims about the Russian economy being under stress. I have to say that the hope that Russia's economy is going to implode or collapse or get run down never seems to die. As I pointed out this time last year, all the talk was about sky-high inflation rates in Russia. We've had more economic news, by the way, over the last couple of days. Inflation in Russia has fallen from about 9.5% at an annualized rate at the start of 2025 to around 5.5% by the end of 2025. In fact, the rate of price growth in Russia overall in 2025 was 5.5%. There's expected to be an upward blip this winter. There usually is in a winter in Russia, but it's almost certainly going to decline again. And it seems that the central bank will continue its cautious program of reducing interest rates. And I think this is now beginning to have an effect. I saw the latest PMI manufacturing, the latest manufacturing PMI numbers coming out of Russia. They spoke about PMI at just under 50%, still in contraction territory, but very slight contraction territory. The economics ministry is talking about an increase in growth this year. Growth last year, by the way, was around 1%, but there's going to be higher growth apparently this year, which is likely as the interest rates fall and provided inflation remains low. And I suspect that by mid-year at least, we're going to see growth not only start to return to the economy, but to accelerate. And we will see the government's fiscal position improve as the rise in economic activity translates into higher taxes. It never ceases to astonish me how this narrative of Russian economic collapse continues to be endlessly recycled and repeated and believed in more than almost 5 years now since the start of the special military operation and the sanctions war. You'd have thought that after 5 years, people would begin to have their doubts, but seemingly not. And anyway, one way or the other, I suspect that, as I said, over the next couple of days, couple of months, the narrative of Russian economic exhaustion will begin to run down, and well, we have something else to take its place. I'm going to finish today's program by returning to another of the many conflicts that the United States is currently engaged in. This time, the conflict with Cuba, where the United States is trying to put economic pressure on Cuba and on the countries that trade with Cuba. President Trump has announced that any country that supplies oil to Cuba is going to face sanctions, or rather tariffs. Freudian slip, because of course they've become essentially one and the same now. Anyway, he's threatened them with tariffs if they supply oil to Cuba, and there has been a tightening, in other words, of the American embargo or economic blockade of Cuba, though this has not so far been enforced by military means. And I have said in many, many programs that Cuba, in this kind of situation, should be seeking help from Russia, its former ally and friend, which insists that it is still an ally and friend, despite the rupture that took place between Cuba and Russia after the end of the Cold War, and which is certainly in a position to supply Cuba with all of the oil it needs and more. And I have said also many times that the Russians not only are in a position to supply Cuba with oil, but they have given many indications that if asked, they would do so. Now, we have now had a telephone conversation between Lavrov and Cuba's foreign minister. And the telephone conversation took place yesterday, and the Russian Foreign Ministry has provided us with a readout. And this is what the readout says that the Russian Foreign Ministry has published. On February 2nd, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had a telephone conversation with Foreign Minister of the Republic of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. During the conversation, the parties addressed key priorities of bilateral cooperation and issues on the international agenda. Perhaps the most important two words in that sentence is key priorities, the most important things. And then the next paragraph reads, the Russian side reaffirmed its principled stance on the inadmissibility of economic and military pressure on Cuba, including attempts to disrupt energy supplies to the island, which could seriously aggravate the country's economic and humanitarian situation. Russia emphasized its firm commitment to continue providing Cuba with the necessary political and material support. Material support is, of course, the key, because, of course, that clearly extends to energy supplies, but to also other things like essential medical supplies or whatever Cuba is at serious risk of running short of. Probably it would take time to get this organized. I mean, you'd have to send ships. The tankers would have to load up, presumably in the Arctic or in the Leningrad region, and there would be several days before they reached Cuba. So you'd be looking at 2 or 3 weeks before the oil came. But possibly, if the Cubans asked for the oil and the Russians provided it, the very fact that it was coming might have a morale boost in Cuba. And it might also, by the way, cause some rethinking in the United States. I say that because any American threats to impose tariffs on Russia in relation to supplies of oil to Cuba would be meaningless given the extent of American sanctions against Russia. And as I've said already, I think it very unlikely that the United States is really willing to tangle with the Russian Navy on the high seas, and it's likely that any Russian tankers steaming towards Cuba would have some level of Russian naval escort. It's been suggested that one of the reasons the Cubans up to now have been reluctant to seek Russian help is because they don't want to provoke the Russians, rather provoke the Americans by seeming to get too close to the Russians. It seems to me that we're well past that point, and President Trump, in his latest statement, threatening countries with tariffs if they supplied oil to Cuba, explicitly said that it was partly because Cuba already had close ties with Russia. So there is no reason to stop buying or seeking economic help from Russia if you are in Cuba's position at this time. And I would add that there are other factors at play as well. I understand that the Trump administration has very, very significantly tightened up visa restrictions on third-party nationals who holiday in Cuba. They would have serious problems obtaining American visas and might not therefore be able to travel to the United States. That has deterred many Western holiday makers from going to Cuba for their holidays this winter. I understand that the tourist flow into Cuba, which is a major prop of the Cuban economy, has slowed to a trickle. But then again, this is hardly going to be a problem with Russian tourists, and there is always going to be a demand in Russia for places for tourists to go to. Perhaps they will spend less than Canadian or German tourists might do, but it's a lot better than nothing. So it really depends on the Cubans. It always has done, in my opinion. I have a difficulty again understanding why exactly they are holding back. This is a clear offer of help. Russia emphasized its commitment to continue providing Cuba with the operative word is necessary, political and material support. Whatever material support is necessary in this crisis, the Russians will provide it. So why refuse it? Well, I went to the Cuban media to see whether this conversation has achieved much attention. Cuba does not have an enormous media, at least not that I can access, and of course it may be that I've missed commentaries and reports somewhere. But I found no mention of this conversation in those outlets, those media outlets, Prensa Latina and Granma, which I consulted. Again, I find this baffling, given the crisis Cuba is facing now. I wonder whether that will change. Necessity, as some people say, is the mother of invention. Obviously, Russia is not going to start World War III to defend Cuba, as it almost did in 1962. But at the moment, what is needed and what is under urgent discussion is economic aid, and we can see that is on offer. Well, anyway, this is where I'm going to finish my program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X, and Substack. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.